Mr. Bison Clips!
Mr. Bison Clips! Mr. Bison Clips! Mr. Bison Clips!
This video continues the analysis of George Orwell's essay, Politics and the English Language. And the first issue he identifies here is the use of dying metaphors and how metaphors, the way they're used, are starting to lose their meaning. So he distinguishes between fresh, newly invented metaphors that are really inspirational or interesting because they're fresh and they're something that we haven't seen before, and those that have been used so long that we even forget about things that they even are metaphors, like the foot of the stairs or the head of the head of the river or something. But his example is iron resolution. But he also then talks about how there are some worn-out, tired metaphors that we actually don't think about the meaning when we use them. And so, for instance, he brings up the idea of toe the line, then how people, the original meaning, which presumably has something to do with seamen standing on the ship and lining up for inspection, is lost, and instead people are using it TOW to show that, about pulling on ropes, which obviously is not what that metaphor is about at all. And he also unpacks the idea of the anvil and how when we talk about the hammer hitting the anvil, we think that the anvil is the victim, but really it's always the anvil that breaks the hammer. So Orwell is trying to emphasize the point that as a writer you should choose your metaphor with care and think about what it means, so try to picture what the metaphor looks like before you actually write it down. I might deviate slightly here from Orwell's essay, just because I want to make this point for your own writing. That you can certainly still use these metaphors, like toe the line or the hammer hits the anvil, but you've got to be aware that they are clichéic, worn-up metaphors. So you can still, for instance, these are two quotes from John le Carré's The Night Manager that I read recently, and I think they illustrate well how you can still use that. So the idea of the metaphor of the glass half full issue is using that metaphor, but to a particular purpose. On a table next to her sits a bottle of vodka, half empty, definitely not half full. So we're using that cliche, but he's obviously playing with that to a very effective, to a very significant effect. Later on in that same book, the protagonist finds himself locked in a wine cellar of a Swiss mountain castle, and the lights go out. Suddenly it dawned on him, if the term can be used in a room of absolute darkness, that he was going to die in here. So again, we're playing with the idea of that metaphor of something dawning on you, which is quite a cliche, but you can play with it in that way and make it quite effective. But back to Orwell. Orwell then continues to talk about what he calls false limbs, verbal false limbs, or operators, and he talks about pretentious diction as one of the ways that we achieve this vagueness, and meaningless words also as one of these causes. He then utilizes parody to rewrite a passage from Ecclesiastes in the Bible into a modern prosaic form to satirize what's happening today and to illustrate his point quite effectively. And then he goes into more the political type of writing, which is obviously the core of the essay, and how language is misused in politics. And he uses the extreme example of how a linguist might justify the killing of millions of people in Russian prison camps, for instance, through his kind of, the euphemistic expression, I guess, while freely conceding that the Soviet regime exhibits certain features which the humanitarian may be inclined to deplore. We must, I think, agree that a certain curtailment of the right to political opposition is an unavoidable concomitant of transitional periods, and that the rigors with which the Russian people have been called upon to undergo have been amply justified in the sphere of concrete achievement. So essentially, by using that whole phrase, he's saying the inflated style is itself a kind of euphemism, a mass of Latin words forced upon the facts like soft snow, and that's the metaphor we looked at before. Sorry, that's not a metaphor, that's a simile, of course, but it's blurring the outlines and covering up all the details. The great enemy of clear language is insincerity. When there's a gap between one's real and one's declared aims, one turns, as it were, instinctively to long words and exhausted idioms, like a cuttlefish squirting out ink. So there's another of those 5 images. In our age, there's no such thing as keeping out of politics. All issues are political issues, and politics itself is a mass of lies, evasions, folly, hatred, and schizophrenia. Really strong high modality language here again. Again, making us drawn into this and almost having to accept it as truth without judging or questioning it. And then as this idea concludes, this is the middle of page 357, that if thought corrupts language, then language can also corrupt thought. And this is really the syllogism that the whole essay rests upon, or maybe it's not syllogism, maybe it is truth, but it's worth thinking about. His thesis anyway is because of this, then this happens, and vice versa. Comically, he does admit here that I have again and again committed the very faults that I'm protesting against. That's him looking back at his own essay. And so he's very sort of modest here in that sense. And again, that's creating that sense of verisimilitude that makes us want to believe him and agree with him. The essay then concludes with what I guess we could call Orwell's 6 rules for writing. He's saying never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. Sounds easy enough. So if we can avoid phrases like toe the line, ride roughshod over, stand shoulder to shoulder, etc., and instead choose a phrase that really suits what we want to say. And he said earlier in the essay, first of all, picture what it is you're seeing, what it is you want to say, and then pick language, so words and images that will suit that particular point, rather than trying to just reuse phrases you've heard before. The second point, I think, is very well illustrated by Hemingway when he said, after Faulkner had criticized Hemingway for being too simplistic in his writing, so Hemingway's response was, poor Faulkner, does he really think that big emotions come from big words? He thinks, I don't know the $10 words. I know them all right, but there are older and simpler and better words, and those are the ones I use. Very well put, no further comment. The third idea kind of blends into what modernism was thinking at the time, or slightly before Orwell's time, and Ezra Pound is probably the best example of this, because he was saying, he chopped his poems down to virtually nothing because he was trying to get rid of anything that wasn't contributing to the meaning. So Pound said, any words that don't contribute to the meaning to a passage dilute its power. Less is always better. Always. Rule 4, never use the passive voice when you can use the active. I don't think I need to go through this example, but it's there in case you don't know what the difference is between passive and active. So if you don't, just stop the video, have a read of that, and if you're still not sure, come and ask me. Rule 5, never use a foreign phrase or a scientific word or even jargon when you can think of an everyday English equivalent. Now, that obviously doesn't apply if that's going to make it more difficult for your audience. If you're in a particular field of science where everyone is used to using that jargon, and that's actually more comprehensible and more approachable and easier to understand than everyday language, then obviously you would use the jargon. And finally, Orwell's catch-all rule. You can break any of these rules sooner than say anything that's outright barbarous. So that's fine. If you want to say something and you want to break one of these rules, please do. I mean, you see Le Carré doing that and doing it quite well. By all means, feel free to break the rules, as long as you do it for the right reasons, not because you're lazy. I hope this has given you an overview of what the main ideas are in Orwell's essay. Obviously, we'll come back and look at closer passages for your commentaries later on, but at least now you should have more of an avenue into the essays to make them easy to read. Bring any thoughts or questions with you to class, and we'll have a good chat about this essay next week.